Niin, arvoisat Paasikivi-Seuran ja kansainvälisen politiikan yhdistyksen jäsenet, tervetuloa tähän meidän kahden yhdistyksen järjestämään paneelikeskustelun tilaisuuteen EUn strategisesta autonomiasta. Meillä on tämä tilaisuus suoratoistaa ja julkaista myöhemmin tallenteena. Meillä on mielenkiintoinen paneelikeskustelijoiden joukko. We are using English in this panel discussion. Here is Piritta Asunmaa, Director General of Political Department of the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Niklas Helwig, Learning Researcher, European Strategic Autonomy, Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and Rasmus Hindrén, Head of International Relations, the European Center of Excellence and Countering Hybrid Threats. Kiitoksia. Alamme keskustella sillä tavalla, että alustajat käyttävät 5 minuutin lyhyen pointtauksen puheenvuoron ja sen jälkeen keskustelu käynnistyy. Olkaa hyvät. Piritta, you start first.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, it is really a great honor to be here and to participate in this panel discussion on a very important topic. So many thanks to Paasikivi Society and FIA for taking this initiative.
Piritta, can I ask you to wait a little bit, 1 minute? I ask Johannes Vänttinen to make a little speech.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Yes.
No, first.
Yes. Hyvä puheenjohtaja Rinne ja arvoisat valtuuskunnan jäsenet, panelistit ja yleisö. Minä olen Johannes Vänttinen ja tosiaan toimin kansainvälisen yhdistyksen puheenjohtajana nyt tänä vuonna ja sovimme Paasikivi-Seuran kanssa, että pitäisin tähän alkuun hyvin lyhyen puheenvuoron siitä, että keitä me ollaan FIAssa ja siitä, millaista yhteistyötä tullaan Paasikivi-Seuran kanssa tulevina vuosina toivon mukaan tekemään. Kansainvälisen politiikan yhdistys on siis nuori, vuonna 2016 perustettu valtakunnallinen nuoriso- ja opiskelijajärjestö, ja me ollaan puoluepoliittisesti sitoutumaton yhdistys, ja meidän keskeisin tarkoitus on lisätä nuorten ja opiskelijoiden tietoisuutta ja keskustelevuutta kansainvälispoliittisista kysymyksistä. Ja me ei olla toistaiseksi kovinkaan tarkkarajaisesti erotelleet sitä, että keskitymmekö sellaisiin aiheisiin, jotka koskettavat suoraan Suomen ulko- ja turvallisuuspolitiikkaa, vaiko tämmöisiin yleisluontoisiin aiheisiin. Nyt minulla ei ollut mahdollisuutta printata kotona, joten olen kuin kunnon milleniaali ja luen tästä puhelimesta. Pahoittelut siitä. Lyhyesti meidän toiminnasta. Me järjestetään erilaisia tapahtumia, mukaan lukien tämmöisiä paneeleja, kuten tässä nyt käsillä. Kirjoitamme blogikirjoituksia sekä pinnalla olevista että katveeseen jääneistä aiheista. Tiedotamme jäsenistöämme, jotka koostuvat siis nuorista ja opiskelijoista, niin tiedotetaan kiinnostavista työmahdollisuuksista ja sitten toimitaan toivon mukaan tämmöisenä niin sanottuna tukipilarina nuorten ihmisten urakehityksen alussa. Lyhyesti yhteistyöstämme Paasikivi-Seuran kanssa tosiaan käynnistettiin tänä vuonna tämä meidän yhteistyö tämän yhteistyösopimuksen myötä, ja tämä paneelikeskustelu on nyt ensimmäinen yhteistapahtumamme. Nyt tässä meidän strategiassa, ei siis meidän yhteisessä, vaan meidän omassa, joka toivon mukaan huomenna järjestettävässä syyskokouksessa hyväksytään yhdistyksen viralliseksi toimintaa ohjaavaksi asiakirjaksi, niin siinä todetaan meidän tavoite kasvaa tämmöiseksi varteenotettavaksi valtakunnalliseksi toimijaksi suomalaisessa kansalaisyhteiskunnassa nuorille kansainvälisestä politiikasta kiinnostuneille ihmisille. Ja meidän pitkän aikavälin tavoite on muotoutua tämmöiseksi Suomen tulevien KV-politiikan asiantuntijoiden kiihdyttämöksi niin sanotusti. Ja tässä meidän intressit Paasikivi-Seuran kanssa selkeästi kohtasivat, koska meillä on tarve saada keskusteluyhteys ja oppimisen mahdollisuus vaikutusvaltaisilta ja pitkän linjan Suomen ulkopolitiikan toimijoilta. Ja Paasikivi-Seuralla puolestaan ymmärtääkseni on tarve jakaa tietoutta nuoremmalle polvelle sekä saada myös nuorempia henkilöitä jäsenikseen. Yksi ideavaiheessa oleva projekti meidän yhdistysten välillä onkin mahdollinen tämmöinen mentorointiohjelma yhdistystemme välillä, jossa PK-seuran ansioituneemmat jäsenet jakaisivat tämmöistä ylisukupolvista tietoa nuoremmille ihmisille. Minä päätän nyt oman osuuteni tähän ja siirrän puheenvuoron puheenjohtaja Rinteelle sekä panelisteille. Ja haluan tosiaan kiittää vielä Paasikivi-Seuraa tästä erittäin hienosta mahdollisuudesta järjestää tämä tapahtuma teidän kanssa ja siitä, että olette ottaneet nuoret mukaan tähän tärkeään ja kaikkia osapuolia hyödyttävään toimintaan. Kiitos.
Okay, thank you, Johannes. Thank you very much. And then we go forward. Piritta, now it's your turn.
Okay, a new start. So once again, many thanks for inviting me to this panel, and many thanks also for taking the initiative of organizing a panel discussion on such an important topic. And I'm also very pleased that there are actually true experts on strategic autonomy in this panel, and this means that I can concentrate on the other issues. No, that's not true. I will approach this topic from a more limited perspective, that is transatlantic relations and development of European defense. And as I have long experience both from NATO and the EU, the topic is certainly very dear to my heart. To start with, how do I define the strategic autonomy? For me, it means EU's ability to defend and protect its values and interests together with its partners, if possible, and on its own, if necessary. And traditionally, the concept has been linked to European defense, but now the concept has widened to cover other matters, such as critical supply chains and technology. But I will mainly concentrate on European defense in the context of transatlantic relations. From the early days of common security and defense policy, then known as the ESDP, the US approach has been ambivalent and even hesitant. European efforts to build defense outside the framework of NATO have been seen as a threat to NATO, which remains the key forum for transatlantic security and defense policy, and where the US is the main player. This ambivalence was expressed in a policy of 3 Ds: no decoupling, no duplication, no discrimination, that was first published in an article by then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright on December 7, 1998. The US wanted to ensure that NATO remained an organization of sovereign allies where European decision-making is not unhooked from broader alliance decision-making. Secondly, the US warned that the defense resources were too scarce for allies to conduct force planning, operate command structures, and make procurement decisions twice, at NATO and at the EU. And thirdly, the US wanted to avoid any discrimination against NATO members who are not members of the EU. And where are we now? Almost exactly to the day 23 years later. The transatlantic relations have certainly experienced their ups and downs, including the divisive Iraq War and the turbulent years of Trump administration, as well as the events of 2014 that re-strengthened the US commitment to European security. The EU has continued building its own defense incrementally, step by step. However, there is also a broad understanding in Europe that NATO remains the organization of collective defense. The crisis in Ukraine, including the latest developments, has only enforced this view. Yet the Treaty of Lisbon has also strengthened the solidarity between EU countries by introducing a mutual defense clause, the Article 42.7. But this has not, however, turned the EU into a defense alliance. The US views on the European defense remained unchanged up to quite recently, always strongly calling for more defense spending and reminding the European allies of their commitment of reaching the 2% GDP target. A lot of time and energy was also spent on theological debates on European autonomy or sovereignty. It is only during the last few months that there have been a change of tone in Washington, D.C., following the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and the AUKUS deal that took the French and the Europeans in general by surprise. The defining factor has been the US determination to challenge the rise of China and focus, therefore, its resources on Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, it is now more willing and interested to recognize the increasing importance of the EU as security and defense actor. The recent US statements by President Biden and Secretary Blinken on the importance of a stronger and more capable European defense prove this. From the Finnish point of view, we support the objective of consolidating European strategic autonomy, as this contributes to improving European security, making the EU into a better partner and strengthening transatlantic relationship. We also emphasize European strategic autonomy cannot take place at the expense of European unity or transatlantic relations. Only a united and capable Europe can be a strong and strategically autonomous and thus a credible partner to the US. It is equally important to understand that European strategic autonomy means bearing responsibility and the determined promotion of our interests. It doesn't mean withdrawing from partnerships, but making these partnerships more balanced. Better European capabilities and ability to act are therefore also in the interest of NATO and the US, as they contribute to improved burden sharing. And we certainly look forward to the work carried forward during the French presidency. But also, from the Finnish point of view, I would like to recall the indispensable nature of transatlantic security and defense cooperation. The US commitment to Europe, both through bilateral arrangements and through NATO, is of key importance for European security and for Finland as well. The fact that EU and NATO are simultaneously working on their respective strategic documents, EU's strategic compass and NATO's strategic concept, offer a unique opportunity to contribute to strengthening the cooperation in order to guarantee our joint ability to tackle the complex security environment of the 21st century in a complementary and transparent manner. As the Commission President von der Leyen stated in her State of the Union speech, there is simply no security and defense where less cooperation is the answer. Therefore, Finland, who has systematically strived to enhance EU-NATO cooperation over the years, looks forward to the new joint declaration, hopefully before the end of the year. In conclusion, we need more, no less, transatlantic cooperation and coordination in order to be able to respond to global challenges. There is more that unites us than divides us, and we have a firm foundation of shared values and shared interests. However, similarly, we need to recognize the US interests and priorities and be ready to assess Europe's and the EU's role in shifting political context. The US commitment to Europe's security is essential, despite the focus of the administration lies now or in the future. The Europe and EU need to stay relevant for the US, therefore we need to ensure that EU stays strong and united as well as more capable. And I certainly look forward to a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piritta. And now it's Niklas Helwig, leading researcher, European Strategic Autonomy from Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Okay. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's really an honor to be sitting here with such distinguished experts and colleagues and well-known political figures as well. So it's really an honor to be here on this panel. So strategic autonomy, it's something that the Finnish Institute of International Affairs now has been focusing on in the last 2 years, because we noticed it became a broader agenda than just focusing on security and defense policy. So that would be the first point that I would like to make, is that yes, defense and security issues and military issues is of course a very important part of this debate, but the strategic autonomy discussion has broadened significantly in recent years. So as was already highlighted, the origin of the term strategic autonomy comes really from defense and military issues, and it goes back more than 20 or 30 years to the 90s in the situation after the end of the Cold War, when there was uncertainty of US commitment in Europe, and the question how to deal as European with European security, when it was not clear whether the US would continue as a security provider. And that led to the adoption of the Saint-Malo document in '98, where there was the first time this mentioning of autonomous military capabilities. And that later on led to the common security and defense policy and so on. And now the discussion on strategic autonomy returned then in the 2016 EU global strategy, when the term was mentioned, also in connection with crisis management and defense issues, and it turned a lot of heads what this means. But since then, we have seen a couple of developments that have broadened the scope of strategic autonomy. One that you already mentioned is, of course, the competition between the US and China, the economic competition, and the question how the European Union is positioning itself in this evolving competition. A second development that we saw was the increased weaponization of economic interdependence. That's a very complicated kind of term, but we can observe that economic relations are not anymore only seen through a mutual beneficial lens, but that they can also be used for coercive means. For example, a very prominent example has been the extraterritorial sanctions that the United States have put on European companies that wanted to increase their economic activity in Iran after the adoption of the Iran nuclear deal. So we saw under President Trump that there were these extraterritorial sanctions, which really limited the ability of the European Union to follow its own approach towards the Middle East. For better or worse, it was not able to be sovereign in its foreign policy because it faced these limitations in the economic sphere. So that really kind of was one of the starting points of the discussion of strategic autonomy that we see today. Then there are other developments like the technological race, of course, that raises the question how we can stay competitive as Europeans, how we can also preserve our values in longer focus on thinking also about security of supply, like you mentioned, and also autonomy on, for example, health questions and other security questions. So we face now this broad debate of strategic autonomy, and I agree, of course, that security and defense is a very important aspect, but we need to also consider what does it mean for our economic policies, and these debates are going on in the European Union when it comes to industrial policies, when it comes to trade policies, when it comes to direct investment screening from foreign direct investments. So there's a whole issue of policy discussions going on in the EU that we need to consider also from the Finnish perspective, how we influence this and how we can influence the debate and the conversation in the European Union in a way that it also preserves our interests. And just maybe to close this, I think you really hit the hammer on the nail when you said that, of course, the transatlantic partnership is something that is very important for Finnish security policy. It's also important. International open trade, liberal trade is also important for Finnish trade policy and economic policy. So Finland has a certain interest that it wants to preserve in this European conversations, and that is something that needs to be highlighted, I think, and that we need to follow as people working in the ministries and people working in the institutes and, of course, in the public discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Niklas. And then, last but not least, Rasmus Hindrén, head of the international relations from the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be in the panel and for organizing this event. And thank you for letting me go last, because I can echo a lot what my colleagues have already said. But let me maybe take the bottom line up front here to ask the rhetorical question, is it needed? Is strategic autonomy needed? I think yes. Can it be achieved? I think that's the wrong question. There are no absolutes in this. It's a process. It's a long-term effort. It must be carefully managed, and it must be done together with partners, as was underlined by colleagues here. I think Niklas opened the discussion on the definition and the differences between the focus on defense aspects and the focus on broader aspects. I think it's crucial to understand that distinction, but I'm not going to discuss that in any more detail. We have spent already too much time sometimes discussing the concepts and the terminology instead of doing it. So, but what I'm going to do is try to answer three questions: the why, the what, and the how in 5 minutes. So, starting with the why, it goes back to the changes in the global security environment, which again were already referred to in the previous comments. First of all, the growing instability in great power relations, which has really, unfortunately, given incentives to malign actors to exploit the growing dependencies and interdependencies in our global system. So it's about vulnerabilities, and the fact that the more there are interdependencies and dependencies, the more there are vulnerabilities as well. And they exist in the area of markets, of technology, supply chains, definitely in the digital realm, and so on. So what should affect our calculus when we consider strategic autonomy? In the first hand, there's internal factors in Europe, which we could spend a long time discussing, because there's not one Europe in that sense. Then there's the other external factors, including China and Russia. The fact that China has become more assertive in its actions, and Russia has shown that it's ready to sometimes disrupt our operating models and leveraging the tools that it has. And then finally, the partners, and the US being the first and foremost among those partners. And I think that was already mentioned, but I think especially the EU-US relationship will be key here in going forward. There's the question about what happens in the long term in the US domestic politics and how that spills over to the realm of foreign policy. In any case, Europe would do well to do some hedging, to use that term, because the way I see it, there are two options. Either the US will keep its focus on Europe, in which case the EU and Europe has to be a better, more capable partner. Or then the other option, which is the less positive option perhaps, but it's still an option, that the US will lose its interest and capability to look after the security of Europe, in which case obviously Europe needs to build up its own capabilities. So the point there is maybe to say that a lot of things have changed since the 90s and the time of the 3Ds and the Albright, the 3D policy. So then what are we talking about, and in which areas? Again, it's about understanding the dependencies. So whether it's raw materials, whether it's technology, industry, supply chains, stockpiles, critical infrastructure, definitely also defense capabilities, communications, and so on. All of this is also connected. So everyone in our societies is dependent on, for instance, communications networks, 5G networks, or satellites for that matter. So these are parts of the dependencies which we need to have a better understanding of and to build capabilities. On the defense side, specifically on defense. Some investments would be needed, but it's also a lot about increasing efficiency and the political will, which translates into decision-making capability. So when we talk about duplication, most of the duplication exists between European states and not perhaps between the EU and NATO as such. So there's a lot to be done in that sense. Where should we invest is first of all on the big things that individual states cannot do. Again, space-based capabilities being a good example of that. And then on the new things. So the big things and the new things. Innovation in defense, for instance, gets less than 1% of all of our defense funding in Europe. And that is way too little when comparing with some other both partners and competitors. Finally, how should this be done? As I said in the beginning, it's a long-term process. It might never get to the finish line, but it must be managed and it must start now. There's a capability aspect to it. As I was saying, we need to build capabilities, but we also need to think about decision making. So together those form the capability to act and the will to act. And again, just to close by underlining the same transatlantic relationship that Piritta was talking about and the need that this should be managed together. And I think the EU-US relationship will be crucial in figuring this out. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All three speeches were very interesting speeches. I was really little bit surprised that there was none of you take up the climate change, global warming. And I think that if we think the strategic autonomy of broad level, the climate issue is very important for us. How do you, if I ask, how do you think about the climate issue in this situation? Who will start?
I can go first, and then just to get the ball rolling. I mean, I think this is an example of an issue that needs to have a real global force behind it, and not just European force. But of course, Europe should be and could be a sort of standard bearer and a global leader in setting certain standards, directing the innovation towards certain technologies, and by and large showing example to the rest of the world. But I wouldn't see it as an autonomy issue for Europe as such, but instead of a global issue.
I will demand you a little bit. Southern Sahara is near Europe. It's not near Asia, it's not near America. And there is millions, hundreds of millions of people. And with their living space is going down. We need to do something. We are their neighbors. How do you think about this kind of speech?
Yeah. Now, I think there are two aspects to this climate change agenda and how it relates to strategic autonomy. One is that it has been picked up as an issue that is, as you also explained, very, very crucial for Europeans, which also relates to certain European values and norms, and which Europeans want to promote on the global stage. So how do they do this? One aspect is, of course, leading by example, like you explained, also being active as a multilateral broker, like we now saw with the latest COP meeting. But there is a new development, which is sometimes also referred to in this strategic autonomy debate, and that is to use the EU's economic instruments to advance the global green agenda. So there is, for example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so a tax on carbon-heavy imports from other countries, on steel, on cement that is being proposed. So this kind of protectionist measure, this kind of market barrier to kind of push your values and interests, I think that is a new development that we see in the EU. we don't need to talk about if it's strategic autonomy or not, but I think it's an interesting kind of turn how economics is not just seen as something, you know, which relates to trade and economic betterment, but which also relates to the promotion of norms and interests. And then, of course, the other side to the climate debate is how does the climate change then impact our security thinking? So you mentioned, for example, deteriorating security maybe in the southern neighborhood of the EU, but there are other examples, and I think that is also part of the strategic compass process, if I'm not mistaken, to kind of think about how does that change our security assessment for our security and defense policy as well. So that is definitely also something to take into account.
A short comment. I'm certainly not an expert on climate change, but I would tend to agree with Rasmus that I don't see it as a strategic autonomy, but it is something that really requires a global answer. And I think it's one of the very few issues where the great powers, US and China, can actually cooperate. And there was a positive development at the latest COP26 meeting where there was a joint statement on this issue by China and the US.
I will ask, now we have Biden as president in USA, and this strategic autonomy came up to discussion here in Europe quite strong when we have Trump as a president. Has the situation changed after this presidential change?
Well, if I may start, and I think the point I tried to make was that no matter which administration is in power in Washington, D.C., we do need to build our autonomous capabilities, because we must recognize that also the Biden administration is concentrating on Asia and really sees China as the challenge. So US is completely not turning away from Europe, but US is certainly shifting towards Asia, and the US security challenges are in Asia. And that has not changed with the change of administration. So the policy under Biden is very much the same than it was under Trump. So the tone in transatlantic relations is very different. We certainly welcome the rhetoric by Biden, but when it comes to the content of policies, actually there hasn't been that much change. And as Rasmus was saying, the US foreign policy is very much dictated by the US domestic politics. So I would see that there is as strong a need to continue building autonomous European capabilities under Biden than there was under Trump.
Yeah, I would just agree and point to the fact that the quest for strategic autonomy began already before Trump. Of course, it gained some prominence during the Trump years, but I would definitely stick by my original comment that we have to keep doing this no matter what kind of administration is in power in the US.
Yeah, we had an American professor the other week in an internal workshop at our institute, and his comment was that, and I think it was maybe a bit too strong, but still, Biden is just Trump with a smile. So, you know, the tone changed, but the policies and as you both mentioned, the structural and the domestic constraints of the US president are there. I think just one small point is where we have to be careful is, of course, that we are not misunderstood on the other side of the Atlantic. And I know that you had been, when you were posters there, very, very active in kind of trying to explain your American counterparts, what do the Europeans actually mean with strategic autonomy. And it can easily be understood as, or misunderstood as, that we want to be interdependent, that we want to decouple, that we want to go our own way. But that is not the meaning of being autonomous. You know, it means that you can implement that you are ready to implement your strategies when the needs arises, also without the help of others. But it doesn't mean that you completely decouple from the US, which is an important partner.
And if I may add, it's also very important to note that the messages that we get now from the US administration are much more understanding of Europe's need to build its own capabilities and being able to act on its own. There was the joint statement by President Biden and President Macron after their discussion following the August deal. That was the first time that US publicly recognized the importance of European autonomous capabilities.
If I think the structures of European Union, is there structures for military forces, European military forces? Is there a base for strategic autonomy in the structures of European Union now?
Well, I mean,
Rasmus is the best equipped.
that's a good question. I mean, if we think about the defense forces, obviously in Europe, defense forces are national prerogative, and the EU itself doesn't have forces, neither does NATO. But when it comes to planning and command structures, NATO has those for the conventional defense and for the nuclear deterrence to quite a good extent. But I think we have to be a little bit more specific here and talk about, first of all, capability development, which the EU can facilitate, can incentivize, joint capability development, joint strategy. That's one thing. And then the other thing that this is just much more complicated than it used to be. The fact that all weapon systems are dependent on the communications networks, on the data links, on the various more and more complicated systems. So we need to invest in innovation to make sure that our systems are up to the level required, which requires cross-fertilization between sectors, not just defense in itself, but defense, various industrial sectors, technology policy, innovation policy, communications, and so on. So it becomes a much more complex and interdependent picture. And again, the EU is quite well positioned to facilitate and foster that kind of innovation and development of capabilities. Then the final aspect is how to use those capabilities. And again, there are the national capabilities, and those could be then deployed on a national basis. Then there's the NATO capabilities, which could be deployed if NATO unanimously decides. And then, of course, there's the EU, including 42.7 article, which allows also for a collective self-defense against armed attack, but again, requiring unanimity. So that doesn't necessarily give you the full answer, but I think it just shows that it's a much more complicated, nuanced, and kind of different layers of gray material in that overall picture.
And if I may continue, I think it's also very important to realize that there is no discussion of really creating collective defense in Europe separate from NATO. There is no political will for that, so there is no discussion on that. What we are doing is very different. It's tackling different kind of security challenges, and Rasmus is also expert on that. If you want to say a bit more about hybrid threats, and because that's where are really the EU competencies and EU capabilities.
Yeah, no, I could just, it's again, on the complexity of things, hybrid threats bringing yet another layer of complexity, because those threats can come from various directions and can attack us in various ways, and where it hurts us the most. But really, what we should be looking at is the full spectrum of these threats. So we shouldn't distinguish that much between lower level threats and upper level threats, but try to figure out a way of looking at this in a holistic, comprehensive manner, and then figuring out our responses, our deterrence against that full spectrum of threats. which won't be easy at an international level, as Piritta was also saying.
Yeah, if I can add one more aspect to this question, I think, you already mentioned that there has been a lot of progress and a lot of work being done on the capability side. So especially after 2016 and the EU global strategy, there has been this whole alphabet soup of EU initiatives like PESCO, EDF, and I don't go into detail of that, but they were focused on increasing the synergies between European defense industries and European military forces as well, without adding necessarily an additional layer on the EU level. No kind of EU army is really considered. So that bottleneck has been really actively addressed, but I see a different bottleneck that is also in the focus, but which needs much more work, and that is the missing European strategic culture. There is no common European strategic culture when, under which circumstances, in what way to then operationalize these capabilities, or the joint forces if you have a certain common intervention group, for example. So there are really different views when it comes to the use of force. The authorization of the use of force is different in different countries. Of course, questions of are you member of NATO or not? How do you relate to the transatlantic alliance? What are the threats that you consider dear to you? There are very different views across the EU, based also on the history of the individual countries and their individual perception of international politics. And that is not easy to change. There's nothing you change just with one strategic document that you put out there, but it requires probably more. But I think the strategic compass process that we see right now is a first good step, as far as I hear from people that are involved in drafting this strategic document that is supposed to be out next spring. This has been quite a valuable exercise, and so these are the incremental steps to think about how to also operationalize and how to act together on security issues. So that will be interesting to follow also next year.
We are now here in Finland thinking where we are going to buy new weapons, aircraft, and if we don't buy those weapons inside from Europe, if we buy it abroad, are we weaken the strategic situation in Europe?
It's a difficult question to answer. Of course, there is within the EU the project of developing the next Eurofighter, the new FCAS fighter system, which is pushed especially by France and Germany, especially by France. But this is only becoming operational when in 2040 or 2035, so it's about the next generation. And of course Finland wants to get fighter jets operational in the next year. So does it make sense to, it's a very, but I think what this question shows is this cannot be only a question about which system is the best, but it's a highly political question, of course, and it's closely watched, I'm sure, from the Élysée Palace in Paris, when we saw the reaction to the AUKUS deal that you mentioned, and the submarine deal with
and the Swiss deal of not.
And the Swiss deal, exactly, yes. But it's also closely watched in the US, and of course it would tie the industrial defense sector, and of course also the military cooperation closer to the United States, and that's of course also a security objective that probably Finland takes into account. Well, I can only probably talk about this so freely because I'm not a Finn.
And you don't work for the government.
Yes, and that as well.
But isn't it so that the whole strategic autonomy is a very political question? It is not a practical, or it is not it is a political question.
Well, it's both in my view, but maybe just to go back to the question, I think for this particular issue we should get the package that suits best our purposes. But I think this issue is more structural and a long-term issue. As you were saying, the next generation of fighters will come online, or future air systems will come online sometimes in the next decade. So we need to look at this from that longer term perspective. How could we align put our procurement processes and development processes in better sync, so that they would be synchronized across countries, and how we could then pool our resources together, put our money in the same pot and say, okay, we're going to start developing this kind of capability. And again, it might happen only in the 2050s or so, but the time to start thinking about it and start doing it is right now.
What do you think about the situation in the border of Latvia, Lithuania and Poland now?
It's worrying.
Also for me.
I feel compelled to say something because it's a hybrid threat and hybrid attack we're facing, and we're dealing with those in our center on a regular basis. But I mean, it's a hugely tricky challenge, exactly because it's targeting those vulnerabilities in our societies, in our systems. It's targeting the various fault lines in societies, whether it's in Poland or Lithuania. It's targeting the fault lines between countries. Poland might have a different view of the situation from some other European countries. And it's targeting some of the vulnerabilities that exist in our legislation and our understanding of the norms around these kinds of situations. So it's very skillfully devised attack, and that's what makes it really difficult for us to counter. But I think the countries involved and the EU has shown some good innovation and some good thinking in trying to diffuse the situation.
Yeah, and it shows also that strategic autonomy, just to build up on this, is not only about military capabilities and those questions and weapon deals, but it really touches also on the solidarity between member states and how they can act in such a situation and how they can exactly make it not happen that you have these fault lines. And it really touches also on reflecting what are our values that we want to portray in our foreign policy. And So yeah, it's a broader issue that we see in this.
There's a very big geopolitical interest in Eastern Balkan now. There is China, which is interesting about that area. There is very many countries which are interested about that area. Is the membership of European Union some kind of tool of strategic autonomy at that area?
Well, it always has been a tool, I think, of EU foreign policy. It was probably the most successful aspect of EU external relations. Was its enlargement policy and the transformation that came with it, and that continues to be the case. But I don't know if strategic autonomy suddenly becomes a catchphrase which kind of puts everything under this heading, and then it becomes a little bit difficult to get any value out of this term anymore. But it certainly is a very important aspect of EU's foreign policy, and of course hotly debated on how to advance on the Western Balkan.
And I think as Finland we are strong supporters of EU enlargement, but only when the countries are ready to join. And I think the situation in Western Balkans isn't quite ripe yet.
Yeah.
Have you something to say?
Easy to agree, and I think it's important for those countries to have that kind of perspective for themselves. There's a lot of disillusionment in the region, and a lot of vulnerabilities as well as a consequence.
An active member of our society, Pekka Kettunen, asks that is it important for strategic autonomy to be a model of climate change to vastustaa ilmastonmuutosta. To fight against the climate change.
I think we discussed already that.
Well, I said yes. You know, I think it is an important objective and interest of the EU, and it is also an area where the EU has something to say, where it has more than in the defense aspects that we discussed as well, where it has real competences, whereas also with the Fit for 55 package has a very ambitious agenda. So to also externally promote this is very important. But of course, this can only be in cooperation with international partners, like we also discussed.
But what about, how do you think this question at this time where energy prices is going up and people are very angry because of those high price, and how we can be at this kind of situation as a model word?
Yeah, it's well, you know, I think. Well, I'm not an expert on this particular issue, but if we are successful in this transition, and it is a difficult transition, we also talk about coal workers in many countries getting out of job and needing a new perspective because coal mines close, and so there's a huge gas prices is one issue, but also there's a huge society change connected with the green transformation. But to successfully manage that could give us a leverage also internationally to be a role model, but that there's a long way to go. And I'm speaking as a German. You know, we are in Germany, the country I know best. They are getting out of nuclear energy at the same time as they go out of coal, and they completely want to switch to sustainable energies. And we have the highest electricity prices in the whole of Europe. And are an industrial country, so it is a very difficult and painful process to go through, but also offers some opportunities when you manage to have a successful transformation.
I think.
Yeah, there was a question over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Axel Mäenpää and I'm from FIRE, and I have a question in regards to your mentioning of fault lines in the EU. In the last year, these fault lines have became painfully visible as there are certain authoritarian governments that are opposed to certain like EU values, and in meantime, it is the clear unstated aim of authoritarian governments abroad to like stoke these tensions and like make apparent a void into terms like European values and prove them hollow as compared to authoritarian systems which serve as their adversary. Do you think European strategic autonomy could be, in part, the glue that holds the union together and like refreshes this union of ours that has seen few slight cracks in the recent times?
Well, if I may start, I haven't been following actually EU discussion for last 2.5 years. I've been concentrating on other things, but I think I'm afraid that strategic autonomy will not be the clue that will that will sort of cure these fault lines, because what it really requires is a joint strategic understanding of our threats, and as you said, there are fault lines, but that also means that when it comes to threat perceptions, there are fault lines that divide Europe. But perhaps...
Yeah, I could just pick up on that, fully agree, and maybe when we go back and think about the nature of the threats we are facing, it's pretty clear that in several ways it's also a systemic challenge. So it's a challenge coming from authoritarian states towards liberal democracies. So that's something to understand. And also, as a consequence, when we think about our responses, how we enhance our resilience, how we develop our capabilities, we need to keep this in mind and not to compromise too much on our values, on our democratic structures and processes, rule of law, transparency, and so on. I don't know if that will then provide enough of
foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world is something that builds up the identity also of how the U.S. sees itself. But Europe isn't at all at this stage, like I think our conversation also showed. And I think these rule of law questions that you brought up, I think that they will rather probably in the next years further divide and weaken probably EU foreign policy. For example, now with the new German government just being sworn in, they want to follow a more principled approach to EU politics as well, and want to have a clearer line on these rule of law challenges in Hungary and Poland. And on the same day as the new chancellor is sworn in, there was an op-ed by the Hungarian president in the German Bild Zeitung criticizing the government already for that. So we see new kind of cultural wars or like wars around this rule of law challenges emerging actually.
Timo.
Incentives which we should acknowledge. And Rasmus Hindrén mentioned duplications and also difficulty for the standardization, pre-standardization. But nevertheless, when we look what should be done, that is the effectiveness and efficiency. So we need to have more impact within the member states, within our cooperation, but we also need to have more results. Less euro spent, more results. And good example is the Baltic Sea. If we look the societal security, civil security issues, how come we are still struggling to develop the civil security systems which are intertwined and there's a synergy between? For instance, when we are dealing with the search and rescue issues, with the Arctic Sea or the Baltic Sea, we should have more integration. We should have more interoperability capabilities. But for some reason, we are maintaining the sovereignty at the cost of interdependency. And for some reason, we are not able to overcome this challenge. So why so? And this is a question and it's a comment.
Very easy question.
I think you know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think you partially answered the question already. I mean, the issues of sovereignty. I mean, especially when we talk about security policy or defense policy, we go to the core, to the heart of national sovereignty, and it's very hard to make changes there, even if you could show some of the benefits that might emanate from doing more cooperation. Maybe part of it is also inertia, because these things have been changing in the last during the last decade or so, and the interdependencies have grown and are still growing. So it's also possible that we might come around to that fact and have more cooperation, but it's definitely taking some time.
Okay, now it's time for the last question. It's Pertti Salonen who asked this question. What is the best result on behalf of Finland under French presidency in the EU Security Conference? The best result?
The best result in terms of good question. But the French presidency, are we talking about the elections or the EU presidency?
EU presidency.
The EU presidency,
yeah.
okay.
At least that's how I understand.
Yeah.
Yes.
I read just what he's...
Well, you know, what to look out for with the French presidency is, of course, France is a very powerful and proud nation that often likes to put a stamp on EU policies when it has the presidency. It will be interesting to see if we'll be able to look at the presidency more as a role as a broker, also taking into consideration the interests of smaller member states and of member states with the different security and also economic policy outlook. So if the French presidency is an inclusive presidency that tries to broker also mutual beneficial policies, I think that would be the best for Finland. Yeah.
I think just to continue from there, I think it's a double challenge. It's about keeping the unity of the union and the member states on the one hand, and then coming up with the concrete, ambitious deliverables on the other hand. And the challenge is that those two things are not always mutually compatible. So, but the balancing of those two is key, and I think it's also crucial a little bit about what Niklas said about strategic culture. Having a little bit better joint understanding of what it is that we're trying to do, what are the threats that we're facing, and what are we supposed to do individually as states and together as the union. So to get a better sense of that direction of travel.
I can nothing but agree with the both gentlemen, and I think we would like to see an ambitious strategic compass approved during the French presidency. But it's also very true what Niklas and Rasmus were saying about strategic culture. We certainly need a common strategic culture. And I think when it comes to France, that sort of requires that also there is understanding not only for what happens in the southern neighborhood, because that's where France sees really the greatest threats to European security, but also what happens in the eastern neighborhood. And I see that, or at least I do feel that there is an increasing understanding also in France when it comes to the challenges felt by the Eastern and Central European members of the EU. So I think we are moving towards the right direction, but it is a long road ahead.
Okay, thank you very much about this very interesting panel discussion. And I will give you a book. Now it's reading for Christmas time.
Okay. Thank you.
Kiitoksia sinne ruudun taakse ja kiitoksia salissa olleille yleisölle. Hyvää joulun aikaa.